Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. This conference is amazing. I don't know how many of you, if this is your first time, but I am blown away. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about story making. I actually work in the media and entertainment industry in Los Angeles, California, and storytelling and narrative are very near and dear to my heart. I actually went to school for graphic design, and one of the core things that I found is as I kept moving forward in organizations, I had to do more and more storytelling. So today we're going to talk about the stories we tell. We do a great job telling stories to customers. Why? We spend thousands, hundreds of thousands of euros and dollars on messaging experts and brand. We don't do such a great job internally. I'm also from New York. I could say some really crappy things and curse. I think we suck at supporting and telling stories to each other internally. But I think the key thing I would like to kind of do, let's do this, is I'm going to kind of tell you about one of the stories I had to tell early on in my career. This was a big event for me. This is a design salon in Los Angeles, California called Evenings at the Loft. Usually it attracts from our community 200, 300 people. They come for great food and conversation. And as I was asked to come in and give a talk on empathy, I found myself, I'll be honest, having a little bit of imposter syndrome, right? I knew, and I came with this goal. I wanted to tell people about some research I had been doing on empathy. And what had happened is, someone had said to me that UXers were more empathetic than engineers. And I was like, that can't be true. My tech lead, amazing. He cares about the user. So I undertook a study, and I did so much research, and I'm like, all right, I am ready to tell everybody what's going on, and I am going to dispel this myth. But when it came time to tell that story, I failed. I was over time. I had 15 minutes. It was a lightning talk. It didn't turn out to be a lightning talk by the time I finished, right? 30 minutes. On top of that, it wasn't good to my host. I set time off. And more importantly, despite my scintillating delivery, people remembered my jokes. They said, you're a good speaker. They didn't get the point. They didn't understand what I came to say, which is that you share that responsibility for your customers together with your engineers, and they are just as empathetic as you. So as I continued in my career, I got more opportunity to kind of deal with these things. And I came to this little acronym that I'm going to share with you today. And what I'm going to invite you to do is to use this when you're creating a communication or a presentation, whether it's external or internal. CARE. I invite you to connect with your audience, clearly articulate your message, make sure that you relate whatever you're saying to that audience, and then enlist them in the process of bringing about the change that you want to do. Let's start with C. Okay. Let's talk about what it means to connect with your audience. Now, knowing your audience is something that we all do daily, right? Hopefully, and I'm sure, we invented these objects, empathy maps. We do research. We should know our users. We should know our customers, our clients. I don't really love the word user. I prefer clients, things of that nature, customers. But one of the things I would argue is many people, they may do a stakeholder map, but do they do an empathy map for their executive? How many people have an empathy map for somebody in their organization or their team? Just a quick show of hands. Cool. Kudos to all of you. And I would invite everybody else to do that, because if you're going to be asking these folks to help you, to work with you, to support your projects, you should understand what they're thinking about, what they're feeling, what's going on for them. I also would argue that there's a little bit of rule of thumb that I'm going to share with you. This is from Nancy Duarte. Are people familiar with Nancy Duarte? I see some shaking heads. Really wonderful expert around storytelling and presentation design. She has a TEDx talk, or TED Talk, that will blow you away on stories. But in her book, Data Story, one of the things she puts forward is there are kind of some archetypes, some tropes we can use when we think about how we're going to communicate with folks. So let's start with your peers. Now, if you're on a team with me, I can use shorthand. We probably know the same things in a discipline. I can use acronyms, and you're going to understand what I mean. You're a great ally. In fact, when I'm going to put together a presentation, I should bring you to the table because you can poke holes in my thinking. Now, if I'm doing a presentation or creating something with my manager or for my manager to use, a different kind of thought process should go into place. What does my manager care about? Well, if you're putting me, I'm your junior UXer, and I'm putting you out in front of people, I care that you know what you're doing. I care that you don't use my social capital, that you present and represent the team well. Now, executives are a whole different breed of cat. Whole different breed of cat, right? You've seen it. You come into a meeting, you have tight 30 slides. You don't get past 5, right? When I am coaching people on putting together presentations for executives, I go, rule of halves. You've got 30 minutes, half it. You might not even get past 5 because they're quick, they're fast, they have an agenda. This is the thought process I'm inviting you to use as you're putting together your next presentation. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, I suggest it. Now, we've talked about knowing the audience. This next one may make people a little uncomfortable. I'm going to suggest that we get vulnerable. Now, if you're like me, you love Brene Brown, you love emotions, vulnerability is your best friend. My argument is that COVID changed the way we appear and interact at work. And I'm telling you, I don't want to go back. I like knowing that the president of my division has a cat who walks across his keyboard just like mine, right? That her kid has just walked in the middle of a conversation and decided to join our meeting. That kind of vulnerability, I think, leads for better democracy and more conversation, and we don't have to put these walls up. Now, you might say, Bern, well, that's fine, but we're going back to work. Why? I don't understand. Can't I go back to how I was? And I go, well, I'm going to tell you a different story. This is a story a little bit closer to home. Now, I had a conversation with an executive who was struggling with some of the requests on the part of our younger teammates to use pronouns. And he's like, why is this stuff at the bottom of these emails? She, he, her, them, they. I can't keep track of it. Why is it important? And I was like, well, I have a choice. I can tell him a story, and I can reach into my information architecture pack, and I can tell him all about the benefits of nomenclature. I can tell him that labels matter. But instead, I told him this story. I'm from New York. My mom is from the Dominican Republic. She actually still lives there. My father's a New Yorican. And when my mom came to this country, she came to the country in the 60s. And when she came just after Trujillo had been shot in the Dominican Republic. She came, and as a result of this change in status, she went from being a second-year medical student to a factory worker. And when I was born, my uncle, Gugin, came to the States to see me, to see the new baby. He was a colonel, the youngest colonel, in fact, in the Dominican Army. One night he went out, and he was killed. He was stabbed 16 times, and ultimately he dragged himself to a hospital. He didn't come home, and by day 2, my father knew something was wrong. They called my grandfather, who came up, and they searched first in hospitals and then in morgues for my uncle. My grandfather was looking for his son, a Dominican. My uncle was dark, like my mother, and he was labeled as a Negro, because that was what you called black people in the United States in the 1960s. My grandfather could not find his son because somebody didn't think about the label that they were using on a form. So when somebody tells you, now, I was gentle with this person, but I was like pointing out, labels matter. The choices we make in design matter. So I'm not saying that every story has to come from personal trauma. That's not what I'm advocating. But there are stories you're experiencing every day. You see things in your workplace that if you can bring into the conversation, may make change happen. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about the importance of getting vulnerable. Let's talk about embracing emotion. One of the things that was fascinating to me, do folks know Gina Davis? She's an actress in the States. She did, a baseball movie. She's very good. Anyway, She's a very powerful woman in Los Angeles, and she actually has a foundation that is focused on gender equality and creating change in the industry. One of the things that she did and her foundation put together is they actually did a study with the USA Archery Foundation, and they found that after Hunger Games with Katniss and Brave were playing in the theaters, 2 years later they saw a 105% rise in young women participating in archery, right? So when we say that emotion, storytelling, the things that get us excited and tap into our hearts don't impact us, that's the reason I'm in this industry. I know the stuff that I make creates cultural change. I mean, I'm not a filmmaker, but I kind of feel like, I'm close to it. So anyway, emotion. I would argue you can bring it into your things. And people go, but no, burn. And it's just like that, burn. The currency of the realm, when I am giving a presentation, is objectivity, facts. I'll tell you, yeah, there's a place for supporting data, but the things that convince are usually in there, in the heart. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about connect. So we've got our C covered. Let's talk about A. And I'm going to talk, it's articulate, right? And I'm going to talk about what and how do you construct a message that motivates. Now, the basics of a message that motivates always start with what it means to the person and who you're actually trying to solve their problem. One of the things I see people who are new to this process often talk about, they talk about their problem, not their audience's problem. How many times has somebody been like, but you don't understand. I can't get them to look at my wireframes. It's about me. No, it's not. It's about what it means for them. And when I'm going to put you in front of a business user, usually some people might go with this approach. They're going to say some facts. They're going to go, from these facts, I have discerned this is the insight that we must take. And from there, I am going to suggest and recommend to you these actions that will solve your problem. Seems like a fair way to make your argument. But in reality, there's a better way to construct it, which is to start, just like we do with everything, with the person that we're trying to impact and work backwards. So imagine if instead of starting with the facts, you started with what the actions and what was going to move them forward, right? So if you said, what do I want them to do? What do I want this person, this audience, what action do I want them to take after I deliver my presentation? What if I said, what is the thing that I need to make them believe that will let them do that action? And finally, what are those patterns, those pieces of data that support what I'm doing? I'm going to give you an example, a concrete one from I used to be a consultant, and I would say, I don't know if everybody's familiar with this term, it's kind of old hat now, but FANGs, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, came down to Southern California recently. They used to be up in Northern California. And it made a lot of the studios and people really uncomfortable because they were getting into the business that used to be the realm for studios. And so what you found is that technology was coming into an industry that had matured and had some processes that needed to change. And so a lot of IT departments were faced with these new players. And they needed to adopt agility. And what was interesting about that, are a lot of people here doing Agile? Show of hands, if Agile's in your shop. Okay, about 50-50. One of the things that happened is as these groups, and I was working with one of the media companies, they're reflecting like, we just can't move that fast. These folks are delivering code every day. The slower ones that had been born Agile were every week. And some of them could do it on the hour. And I'll be honest, the studios and some of these organizations, they were getting code out every 3 months. So they needed to adopt Agile ways of working. So we had to put together an argument that said, hey, this is what it looks like for us to be Agile. We need to be more responsive because our deals are tied to it, right? Our salespeople cannot compete in the marketplace. We need to be able to respond in weeks and days, not months. That message was clear and crisp and concise, and it had supporting mechanisms. But I would argue that when I tell you the FANGs are coming for you, you listen, okay? All right, so just a little illustration of what it means to articulate. Now, you don't always know that you're going to get support. In fact, most of the time you anticipate objections. when you're making a presentation, the other person is kind of listening with what I call a cinematographer's ear, right? They're listening and go, okay, is this information valuable? Do I need to keep it? Keep it, throw it away. They throw away a lot. And the reason they throw away a lot isn't because they don't love you, isn't because they don't respect you as a colleague. It's because we get so much stimulus coming into our brains as human beings that we can't retain it all. So what happens when you're kind of dealing with and anticipating objections is that while you've just made a very salient point, your audience is already thinking of a counter. And if you don't kind of respond to that counter in a conversational way, they're stuck thinking about the objection. They're not listening to your next point. So a way you can make your stories more compelling is to build in this cadence. We'll talk a little bit about beats in a minute, where you say, here's my point, and that might mean to you, or you might be thinking that, where you're taking that objection and you're putting it in the room, and hopefully you've got a counter. And you just keep going. Here's my point. This might make you think this. Well, actually, it made us think the same thing, and we did that, okay? So you go through this cycle of putting up your evidence, anticipating an objection, and responding to it. Now, what I would argue is there's also a really important thing when you are putting together these arguments. Now, people probably have heard the rule of threes, but this is the biggest problem we have, right? You've all seen it on Netflix. You've all seen, the jokes are they made it into movie culture, into Silicon Valley, death by PowerPoint on YouTube, right? Haven't you been, and they're getting their slides up, and you're like, oh, Lordy, they are 79 slides. It's going to be one of those today, okay? What I would argue is that you can really cut back and ask yourself that question, is this essential? Could it be better handled in an appendix or a handout or a leave behind or a different conversation? Respect people's time. Don't info bomb them. It hurts. We've all been there, okay? As we kind of clear up and finish up, articulate, I wanted to talk about this quote, which is a favorite. I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one. Mark Twain. I think he's a neuroscientist in disguise, and the reason I think that is he knows we don't have the capacity as human beings to hold it. So when you're thinking about what you're doing to your colleagues, do unto others. Write the short letter. Okay? We're going to move on to R, which is relate. And I've heard this said a couple of times in sessions with folks. This came up in our conversation with Jorge, did his information architecture for design leaders, and it was amazing. He said, context is key. Context makes the difference. You don't learn something or understand something without relating it to something you already know. Think about that for a second. If I need to create context, and think of it like Velcro, I have to have a hook in my information that is going to hook onto something you know. If it doesn't, it floats around and it falls out the other ear. I mean, metaphorically, of course. But think about, here's a concrete example. We're all at a conference. Oh, I had mine on before, but it was, the tag. How often does somebody tell you their name and it's gone because you didn't necessarily make a story or associate it with them? And you're like, oh, but they were so fun. We had a great conversation. We were at a table, and now I don't know their name and I can't LinkedIn them. What I would argue is the story that you create and purposefully make to attach them to something you know. So for example, I met Pascal. He's been in a couple of our workshops. I associate Pascal with a friend of mine, Claude. He's got the accent. I understand. There's a whole French thing. It's beautiful. I'm not forgetting Pascal's name now. Okay? So what I would argue is keep in mind context, and creating context in your story is important. So when we think about the audience, we have to understand what they know, what comes up. So the context I'm going to create for someone in marketing from New York might be different than the context I create for my husband, who's from the Netherlands and in logistics. Now, another little tool that we have is the gift of the 3-act structure. You all probably heard beginning, middle, and end. Always have a strong beginning. See, you should have a good middle. It's going to kind of rise up. But this is actually based on Aristotle's theories of drama. And the idea is that you set up an inciting incident, something that's going to make your characters have to take change. And as that story arc, well, I guess I should go this way. As that story arc rises, you're creating tension. And that tension is palpable for your audience. That tension, like what's going to happen, what's going to happen. If it's a really good story, a film, a theater play, it gets you hooked. And then it gets to the point where you have to release the tension, right? Let's look at this in action. One of my favorites is The Lord of the Rings. I used to read this as a kid every summer, right? Call to action, Frodo, here's what's happening, my bud. You're going to go out into the world. You got a ring to bring up. Get stabbed. You have some bad interactions with spiders. Doesn't really work out. But still, he takes the call, and he decides that he's going to take that ring to the mountain and destroy it. He's going to do that. He's a very, very brave hobbit. All you geek people are with me. You're behind him, right? But this story form is a pattern, just like any other design pattern. And there are many story patterns you can use. You can use this in your talk. The hero could be your team. The hero could be sales. The mountain that they're climbing could be whatever your goals are. So use patterns and use stories and shapes of stories that your audience is going to recognize. It's just like an affordance, right? It's a quick way to get them to follow along. Now, if I'm really conscious about the last part of this, this is where we talk about putting your content into story beats. So if you've ever watched television or read a script, you'll note that there are these kind of punctuated moments, these beats in how you tell a story. I'm going to argue that you can create a rhythm in how you convey information during a presentation. The first beat might be a piece of evidence. You know that you're going to expect your objection. You're going to counter it in your next. Again, beat number 2, evidence, objection, beat number 3. I come to understand that that pattern and frame, those story beats, are going to work for me. We're on our last letter. You might be tired. I appreciate you hanging for the first 3. This is called enlist. Now, quite often, as the keepers of experience in our teams, and as the partners for experience, we have to bring others along. And more, user experience and design, yes, you hear that everybody wants a seat at the table, the designers, the tech. I often think there's nobody at the table because we all think we don't have a seat at the table. But I'm like, who's in the room? But here's what I would say. Bringing people along, not only is it enjoyable, it's mandatory because the things you're trying to do are important and hard. So the first thing you're going to do when you're enlisting someone is you have to make the ask. You have to do the call to action, right? Now, we know about calls to actions on our pages, on our UIs. Here's my submit button. Here's my login button. What's the button you're giving your audience in the presentation? Are they clear that you're asking them to set up a meeting with that high-ranking executive? Are they clear that you need them to support you? Are they clear that you need them to be explicit in your approval? I'm asking you to make your calls to actions explicit for your audience, okay? All right, if we now kind of cruise along from our ease, take the temperature. After your presentation, you're probably going to leave room for Q&A, and if you're lucky, your executive lets you get there, right? I also would argue, sometimes people feel like, oh my gosh, I got to the questions and answers. I have to answer it now. Take the temperature, and don't undo all the good work you did with your crystal story. You've made it tight. If you don't have the answer, take the moment to say, wow, that's an incredible question. That's really good, and I think it deserves the best answer. I'm going to come back to you on that. It works. Most of the time, if somebody needs an answer immediately, they'll tell you why, and you can say, this is my best guess. But give yourself that room, okay? All right, we're going to finish up with rethink the leave behind. How many times has somebody given you those 79 pages, one-sided printed out? Okay? I'm going to tell you, don't do that. Make a handout. Oh, did I pass it by? I forgot to tell you. I gave you a QR code. So if you want that little handout, that cheat sheet, wave your phone at it, okay? When the phones go down, We'll be good? So I want to end on a thought. Oh, sorry. I want to end on a thought. You guys all saw the chopsticks. Remember I told you I had imposter syndrome that day at Evenings at the Loft, or that evening at Evenings at the Loft? I had the same thing happen when I was coming ready. I was like, oh, Bruno invited me to Lisbon. I'm international now, right? But I got scared. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm going to be hanging out with Jorge and Christian Crumlish. These are people who have books. I don't have a book. I'm just a chick from LA, right? And what I realized is I was thinking about me. I wasn't thinking about you. And I said, what are some of the easiest ways to help you remember the things that I think will make you more successful as you do presentations? And I went, I'm going to do an acronym. And I had a moment 3 days ago, called up my mentor, Errol. He's a professor at Art Center in Pasadena. And I'm like, Errol, I can't pull off the acronyms for you. I think I got to restructure it. I think I got to start again. And he's like, Bern, are you trying to tell me that chopsticks aren't good? And I said, Errol, what do chopsticks have to do with acronyms? He's like, well, they're just 2 pieces of wood. But I think 3 billion Chinese people say they're okay. So what I would argue to you is use the tools that serve us. Know that you may have that same thing that I have every once in a while that makes you rethink. But if you go back to who you're talking to and the story that you're trying to tell them and deliver it well, it can lead to great change. Thank you.